And I think despite, however, the tremendously weak position that Castillo entered the presidency in, somehow we're seeing this explosion of protests in opposition to recent events. So you mentioned earlier, Jose Miguel, that Boluarte hasn't made any effort to reach out to ordinary Peruvians to get their say on what should happen next. And in fact, had began by saying that she was going to see out the remainder of her term up until the next cycle of elections in April 2026, has now conceded that elections will happen earlier in 2024. But this is seen by the populace as insufficient. And there are numerous demands being made for next steps. But let's talk about that. Exactly who is protesting? Jose Miguel, you began to paint a picture of the different political constituencies that are in Peru. And on top of who's protesting, what exactly are their demands? What is the trajectory of this protest? Could it erupt into a nationwide movement, or might it collapse under the burden of the repression that is currently happening? As you said, Jose Miguel, more than 47 fatalities so far.
Wow. If we try to answer who are protesting now, we can say that they are mostly people in the regions of the highlands. Regions like Cusco, Puno, Ayacucho, Huancavelica, Junín, Arequipa, the southern Andes. Also, in some regions like to the coast, Pacific coast, like La Libertad, Ica. In some other places of the country, there are also protests, but they haven't had the same impact and the same capacity to gather so many people like in the southern part of the country. And that's because, and people in Lima, I have to say this strongly, once again, we are seeing that this city, Lima, is absolutely and hideously ignorant about how well politically organized are people in the Andes. They are absolutely ignorant about that. You can listen to the politicians, the journalists, and so many other pundits stating that those who promote these protests are mostly drug dealers. First they accused the subprefectos, then remnants of the Shining Path and the Maoist guerrilla of the 1980s. Then they accused Evo Morales and Bolivian agents. And now they are accusing Castillo, who is imprisoned and who has no lawyer. He has lost 8 lawyers. So that guy is organizing these wide and massive protests. So they are changing the version over and over again. And what we are seeing here is communities. They gather together, they have meetings, they vote, and they have done that for decades. For example, in Cusco, Apurímac, and Puno, especially in Puno, we have these campesino organizations called the Rondas Campesinas, and they have annual meetings in an organization called the Macro-Regional, Junta Macro-Regional de Rondas Campesinas. And they have a long history, and they are very, very independent from any leftist party in Lima. Indeed, they are very critical of them. And they are organizing people. People collaborate, they put their money in, and they hire trucks, and they travel from all the different provinces to protests in the cities. And at the beginning, they were calling for the liberation of Castillo. Some of them were calling for the liberation of Castillo, but as the protest grew bigger, the call instead was for the dissolution of Congress They ask Dina Boluarte to renounce, and they are calling for new elections, and in other cases, for a new constitution. Some of the most, let's say, centrist asks from the people, they want at least a referendum to decide if Peruvian people want a new constitution. At least that. But in Congress, they don't want even to talk about that possibility. Not a possibility of a national assembly or a new constitution. They don't want to talk a referendum. So that's the situation now. So we can see here that there are many different requests and many different interests here. But now I would say that people want overall to get rid of this Congress, and they want new elections soon. And that's urgent because with the proposal of Boluarte, she proposed to have new elections of course, after popular pressure. She proposed to have new elections in 2024. So within 2 years, no, within 1 year, more or less, 1 year and a half. And during this time, Congress says that they are going to make changes. They are going to make reforms. What kind of reforms? They want re-election for Congress members. They want to start 2 chambers. We have just 1 chamber. But those proposals were just rejected in vote in 2018. There was a national vote, a referendum, and Peruvian people voted against re-election and against having 2 chambers. But they want to start those reforms to continue in power. So that's the reason why the population do not trust them.
Mm.
Could I jump in with just one quick thing? One kind of anecdotal observation. Jose Miguel spoke very well about the kind of the epicenter of the protests being in the Andean south, the highlands. And of course, the thing that the media, especially the Anglo media, has not picked up on is that there are very few protests taking place in Lima. I think that was, when Jose Miguel was kind of had his thinly veiled dig at Lima. I mean, there's really very little. Maybe there's more now, but the last I saw is there's very little political activity happening in Lima. And I think really what this goes to is a really deep-seated issue that, again, Jose Miguel can speak powerfully to, which is really about the central kind of antagonism or central contradiction, in Peru, which is a regional one, maybe even more than the political spectrum, or maybe more than class, maybe more than race. I mean, it kind of, those are all subsumed in some ways under this intense regional conflict, and the fact that like Jose Miguel was saying, that the left itself is not even able to really see how powerfully organized the communities are in the highlands is pretty eloquent, of this disconnect. And I think one thing that Jose Miguel and I were kind of speaking about before is that this disconnect is now feeding not only into these demands that we're seeing for a new constitution. One of the key features of a new constitution would be a further decentralized state, I imagine. But it's been also feeding into some growing demands for secession, for actually separating from, for these southern areas, southern Andean regions, actually separating from the country that contains Lima. I mean, those are, that's been latent throughout Peruvian history. And I mean, there's been political movements that have had that banner in the past. But I think, I think it's Jose Miguel, who's there, can confirm whether or not. But I think that's growing stronger now. I don't. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, and that's not the case. But it seems to be.
Could we talk a bit about that? Like, first, how this disconnect emerged in the first place, to the extent that it's possible to answer this question. And how did it happen that the rural highlands of Peru ended up being so disenfranchised, and so much political and economic power was concentrated in the metropole of Lima, especially considering the fact that, if I understand it correctly, the mineral wealth of Peru is concentrated in the rural highlands. So how did that regional power imbalance develop and become so stark throughout Peru's history?
Let's unpack this slowly, going back in
Please.
time. And I am going to cite here a work that is not mine, is a Peruvian professor. She is Cecilia Mendez, and she has a work. She works on the 19th century. And what she argues and what she has shown in her work is that while social scientists used to attribute the origin of this divide to a sort of colonial heritage, that argument or that idea can be very misleading. And instead, we should look at the origins of this divide in the 19th century. Since at the beginning of the Republic, the political power from the capital, needed to be negotiated with local leaders in the southern region, in the highlands, with rural communities, with peasant leaders. They needed to have some concessions from these leaders to be able to establish the government. And it was in the mid-19th century when Lima started to grow its power thanks to exportations of commodities like guano, that they gained economic power, and they had very much more prominence and weight than the southern part of the country. So there was a kind of shift on political power and also economic power. And it was also the moment, the mid-19th century and the late 19th century, when all these sort of racial theories were adopted by Peruvian elites. Racial theories that emphasized the backwardness of the highland people, that emphasized the need to regenerate the Indian. And they created, indeed, a new category. They gave a new meaning to the word Indian. While during the colony, you could have Indians, everywhere in the country. In the coastal region, in the cities, they could be lettered people, they could be well-educated people, traders, and be part of many different, perform many different jobs, many different crafts. Since the late 19th century, the word Indian was mostly identified with the following features: someone who lives in the highlands, someone who is inherently poor, a Quechua speaker, and an ignorant, and unclean, by the way. So those features were assigned and linked with the word Indian and also indigenous, because they became synonyms. That's one of the reasons why when you go to the highlands, to many communities, you can find many different attitudes in relation to those words. Many people reject the term indigenous, for example. They embrace the term Aymara, I am Quechua, or I am simply from my town, from my region. But many of them don't want to be called indigenous at all, because the meaning of that word for them is very insulting. It's a very colonial term. Other people instead claim to be indigenous because they are trying to recover the meaning of that word, to change the meaning of that word. So we can have here a very diverse spectrum of point of views in the highlands. And that's one of the factors that it's very gravitating here. in this divide that has very, very long roots, very old roots, I mean. And what is going on now is that we can also see how, while people in these communities are protesting sustainably, in a very sustained way, every day, and they are carrying on strikes. In Lima, the response has been very, very shy. And I can say this because I have been in protests here in the city during the last 15 years, or even more, 2006. Yeah, since 2006. And I remember every time we had elections, the movement Noa Keiko or the anti-Fujimorism, they called for manifestations, marches, protests in the city, and these protests were massive, were wide. We could see there are many leaders of the media, many of these celebrity leftists that we have here in the capital, and people who belong to cultural movements. I don't think they are indifferent now, but they are not protesting like they did before. We don't see those massive manifestations like we have in 2000, in 2006, in 2011, or what happened in 2020. In 2020, when we had an usurper in that terrible week, where two students of a public university, by the way, not a private university, they were students of San Marcos in Lima, they were killed by the police. The next day, the president had to renounce because all the popular pressure. But now we have 47 people assassinated, and the government continues, and Congress even ratified this cabinet. And I just want to add here a very critical player here, a very critical actor here, which is the media. Just to give an example, in the last election, after the runoff, when the electoral institutions were counting the votes, there were protests in Lima with people from all the regions of the country in support of Pedro Castillo. And they were trying to protect the vote because all the lawyers hired by Fujimori and the right wing were trying to suppress the vote from people from the highlands. And they were very, very specific. They say that people in the highlands, they have voted and they have filled the ballots, the boxes, in a very reckless way. So, and they don't know how to vote. So they were trying to suppress the vote of the poorest people in the country with the support, with the help of the wealthiest law firms in the city. And that was very eloquent. And on the other side, we have protesters coming from the wealthiest neighborhoods of Lima, Miraflores, San Isidro, San Borja, La Molina, with their huge cars. It was like a parade, like the motor show. And they went to the center of the city. Okay. Wow, the media only covered those manifestations, who were pretty small. They gave full coverage to those protesters from the wealthiest neighborhoods. And we had hours and hours in many TV channels with that side of the story, like in the times of Fujimori's dictatorship, with the difference that now we didn't have a dictatorship, but the media acted like that. Here, the Familia Miro Quesada and El Grupo El Comercio, they are the owners of almost 80% of the printed press. And they have the support of all the business associations in the city. So that's a critical actor. And that also expressed this divide. people in rural towns and in the regions, they don't trust the media. They follow the media. They watch all the mainstream TV channels and the radios. But they also have regional media, local radios, and they are informed not only by that, but also by their own experience. So I think that they are far more well informed than people in the city.